Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to a one-hour partnership of Eldridge and Company and City Talk. Joining me is the host of City Talk, Professor Doug Muzzio, and our guest, Gail Collins, who's written a book on the history of women in the United States while making history herself as the first woman to be the editorial page editor of the New York Times. The title of the book, America's Women, 400 Years of Dolls, Drudges, Helpmates, and Heroines, tells immediately how interesting and well-written the book is. Filled with excitement, suspense, humor, and pathos, it begins in 1587 and ends in 1970. Gail, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
But how did you get the idea to write such an epic?
It just came to me. I just love to do history stuff, and you know, the more I thought about it, we kind of played with different ideas, and that this was the story I wanted to do. The thing is that now there's so much great history written about America's women, but it's mostly very narrow. It's like midwives in the 1700s, or else it's very broad, but it's more academic. And I thought if I could read all the books I could get my hands on and then kind of spin one story, it would let everybody have a chance to kind of sample the stuff that everybody knows.
And it really does it very successfully. I mean, being the professor, your bibliography and your references are really remarkably rich.
Thank you. I love it when people like my bibliography.
No, your bibliography is great, madam. But the central theme, this tension that you weave throughout the story between the urge to create a home and the yearning to get out of it is just it. And there's so many different nuance to that one theme. What attracted you to follow this? What motivated you to keep going? And what were the things that said, "Oh my God, I've got to look at this further"?
There were the little tiny things are what gives you hope.
Yes.
You know, you're sort of staggering along and you're thinking nobody is going to want to read about the colonial women and their household problems. And then you run across one of these letters. You know, one of my favorites was this letter from Elizabeth Drinker, who was a matron in Philadelphia at the end of the 1700s, very prominent woman. And she writes about getting a shower box put in her backyard, you know, and you just pull the thing and the water comes down. And she writes to a friend, it really went very well. I tried it out for the first time, and I think I really did very nicely, considering I had not been wet all over in 27 years. You know, they didn't do clean back then. I mean, it was not until the 19th century when women didn't have to do all the things they had to do during the colonial period, make all the stuff, weave the cloth and spin the thread, that they actually had time to think about cleanliness. And then the bar went up through the ceiling almost instantly.
And you trace that also, I mean, from each of the different eras out to the women in the South or the plantations. But there's always a contradiction. I mean, the basic contradiction is they nest and they create a home and then they want to get out. But then it's the contradiction in it that they can't stay in it. They're forced out sometimes by
the early
events
women,
of the time.
the absolute great career goal of virtually every woman in early America was to be a full-time housewife, because that was where you could be in charge. You could be a manager, you could be creative. Otherwise, you're working for some guy in the fields, or you're working for another woman in her home. So that was the place where you really came into your own, and where you became powerful, and where people respected you because your family could see that you created everything they needed to survive. And in the colonial period, that it was an enormous source of respect, that even though people thought women were not too bright and they were sort of lustful and they had to be guided a lot and they weren't really reliable, despite all that, they happened to notice that when their own mother was in the household, that she was doing everything they needed done, that she was critical. So it wasn't until the 19th century, when people moved to the cities and you stopped doing all this stuff, that suddenly there was this kind of crisis about, well, what is the point of being a housewife? What am I about if I'm not creating any wealth anymore? I'm not economically important. And that's when both men and women developed this strange theory that we call now the true woman, which is that women were in charge of goodness. Men love this. This was great. You know, men are not in charge of goodness. They can do whatever they need to do because they're earning money. But women are in charge of goodness, and they sort of stay home and radiate goodness, and that's their job. And they're good. They know what's good. Men don't really, but that's okay because men have to earn a living.
But what I found striking was the way that the society continually redefined women, and women both accepting the definitions and then fighting against the definitions. It's more an internal battle, if you will, within the gender than between men and women oftentimes.
Yeah, it's not really, although on a person-to-person basis, often, living with a bad man is, the worst thing that can happen to a woman when you're in a helpless state, particularly.
Sure.
But it's not mostly men sitting around plotting about how we can, keep women down. It's everybody kind of trying to come up with what the plan is here. And women, it was very important to women for so long that they'd be allowed to stay home. After the Civil War, one of the most saddest stories, and a story that basically is not a sad story. This is kind of a happy win story, I think, in the end. But after the Civil War, the one thing that freed slaves most wanted was for the wives to stay home and take care of the children. It was just their passion that they should create a stable family and that they could protect their children, which they could never do before. And it drove white people nuts, the idea that black women had the same vision of what a woman should be that the white middle class did. And there were all these letters from the Freedmen's Bureau, which is supposed to be down there helping the slaves, saying, I can't believe it. They're so idle. They want to sit at home gossiping instead of going out in the fields the way they're supposed to.
But throughout the book, you always have that one group looking down or suppressing the other group. And it's fascinating. It goes right through it, doesn't it? I mean, we do that all the time.
Yeah, and it's not, it's different groups in different times, although certainly, black women,
that's still a struggle, and it has always been a struggle.
For Irish, when the Irish first came, especially in the South, the idea was you protected your black slaves because they were valuable, and you sent the Irish out to do all the dangerous stuff, which was why it was so difficult to maintain an Irish family, because the men couldn't get jobs, and when they did, they were often injured or killed in the process.
And who were the people who first came over? That was another interesting revelation.
The Vikings.
The Vikings. I love the Vikings.
Right.
Yes, it was like, we were not, I always start with 1604 with Jamestown, which is the beginning of our country, but the first women who came over, the first women from Europe, were Vikings, the ones we know. The first women whose names we know in this country were Gudrun and Phaedrus, who were two Viking women, and they came over with Leif Erikson and his group. They were in Canada. They were probably also in the United States, and they were the perfect good woman, bad woman, because Gudrun was like the wife, and she was good at meeting strangers, and she could make friends with the new cultures. She traveled all over the universe practically at the time. She was in Italy, she was in France, she was in Iceland, ended up a nun, but she was sort of the good woman of all times. And Phaedrus is the bad woman. She decides to murder all of her trading partners so she'll get to keep the money, and she personally murders the women and children in the group. And this is at least the story they tell, the really good woman, the really bad one. But at one point along the line, Phaedrus is at an encampment, and the Indians attack, and all of the Viking men are terrified, and they run away. And Phaedrus, who is pregnant at the time, unsheaths her sword and whets it upon her breasts, and naked runs after the Indians, and they're so terrified they run away. So she was a helpful person to have around.
And then in the South we had Virginia
Dare, that was the colony that didn't work out, Roanoke. And, Eleanor Dare was another... Virginia was her daughter, but Eleanor was sort of another one of the first women whose name we know. And you can't figure out, when her husband comes to her and says, well, we're going to get in this boat. I know that you're extremely pregnant right now with your first child, but we're going to get in this boat, little tiny boat. We're going to go across to this continent in which there is nothing but this one little settlement we haven't heard from in several years, and we're just going to get in there and colonize.
And
what she was thinking, either she was very easily led or she was a very independent and brave woman. We're not sure.
One of the striking things was the high level of mortality among the early women, and particularly, I know, I mean, I grew up with women, and I have, a wife and a woman daughter.
You don't have to explain.
The amount of work, even today, physical work, and you telescope back 3-4 centuries, it's just astounding the amount of hard physical labor that went on both inside and outside the home. It's no wonder the mortality rates were so high.
It was interesting with the Pilgrims on the Mayflower, when this group, first of all, the group comes in, and again, this is the North, this is New England, but again, these women are looking out over this whole continent. And as far as they know, they're never again in their lives going to see anyone who speaks English. They're never again going to see anyone except these other families who they're really coming to not like very much because they've been locked up together in this boat for so long. They'll never have any stuff that's not there. They didn't bring spinning wheels. Any clothes that they that's the end of the road. So they're out there looking, and the wife of the leader of the group throws herself overboard. I mean, they claim that she somehow managed to fall overboard in the harbor while she made it all the way across the ocean.
It's so appropriate for today with all the people, the immigration that we have, and all these people transplanting themselves. I'm always amazed at the courage that it takes for a family to just pick up and move to this country. But can you imagine when you have nothing?
Nothing. You just
except they never knew that there was anything else, right?
Well, they didn't. I don't think
they didn't have. It wasn't that they didn't. That they were going to a very they were coming from a sophisticated place to a sophisticated place.
No, but I do think that they had a vision that there'd be other people around. Their sense of how big the thing was not very well defined.
Right.
But in New England, once in the Mayflower, all of the adult women virtually died. And it wasn't being a woman because the young woman survived. And we presume it's just that the women were so busy taking care of everybody else that they were their health was undermined before anyone else's.
And one of the threads that runs throughout the work is the difficulty of single women, and particularly single women with children.
Oh, yeah.
Always, always, always face these unbelievable
hardships. Except the only time it works out is when you happen to hit one of those little golden moments in which women are a tiny minority.
Okay.
In the early South, in the far West, when the pioneers were happening, when suddenly you've got one woman for every 6 men, things work out really, really well for them.
Okay, well, that segues into voting in Wyoming. The Western states gave women the franchise much earlier, and you describe it in very similar terms as you just
Yes,
discussed.
It was right after the Civil War, and nobody, women aren't voting anywhere, but in Wyoming there's like 12 people. There's a tiny, tiny settlement, and it's 6 men to every woman. And the basic thought when they start to talk about voting is, well, if Wyoming gives women the vote, it'll be like a big ad for Wyoming, and women will want to come to Wyoming.
It was done for that reason.
It was a sales pitch.
And it didn't rise from the women.
No, well, it did. Women wanted to vote,
yeah.
but they weren't threatening to the men because there's only like 12 of them. Right. So it's not a sense that they'll overpower you in any way. And they did find then when they started to vote, they kept sending letters back to the women's magazine saying, this does not mean we're not good women, and we're, okay, we just vote.
If you lived in Boston or some other place that was settled, was it hard to get married?
It was harder and harder as time went on in places like Boston because the younger men would keep going west. So there's especially in Massachusetts, there was just a ton of single women. That's where the whole New England spinster thing sort of first came from. And there's some thought that the whole Salem witch thing started out with these young women the young women in New England, when they weren't married yet, were sort of the lowest people on the totem pole anyway, but then the sudden nervousness that maybe you never would get married, the sort of angst that was kind of abroad in the community might have pushed things
So it became
forward.
a psychological thing that they
but in the early South, if you happened to not die, which was very unusual because everybody was dropping dead from malaria, if you were a woman, you didn't die, you could go through 3, 4, 5 husbands, and you kind of picked up his inheritance along the line. So
and you didn't always come here with a husband. A lot of the women in the South and they came
to get married.
Right.
And that's unusual in our history. And the only really ethnic group during the immigration period where that happened was the Irish. Irish women came alone. And they didn't seem to come looking for husbands. The places that they went to were not the best places to get husbands. They were the best places to get jobs. But it was sort of something that was adopted from traditions in Ireland, that the young girls would go away, the boys would stay on the farm.
So you always had women, though, that pushed for more and that were thinkers of the future and really wanted to change things. But you also had the pressure of the circumstances outside. So it managed to balance. I mean, was it much different than it is now?
People always ask me like my favorite time and my favorite sort of women in the
question.
My favorites are the women of the early 19th century, the hero women, because that was a time when the vision of women, because of this whole true woman thing, was so narrow that you stayed home. Public places were bad and evil, and they were in fact pretty dirty and rough back then. You stayed home in your house and radiated goodness. And it was very huge, the idea that nobody went out and did stuff. And I go to so many things, I know you do too, all the time, sort of groups where women are encouraging each other, and you go girl, and all that stuff.
Right.
Nobody thought it was a good idea, and yet you have people like Elizabeth Blackwell, who decides to become a doctor, goes to her best friend Harriet Beecher Stowe and says, I think I'd like to be and Harriet Beecher Stowe says, what are you thinking of? You can't be a doctor. Men are doctors. You can't. But she did it anyway. Wound up in New York, graduated first in her class, and had a clinic in downtown New York during the draft riots, during the Civil War. Her clinic was surrounded by a mob that said they would burn down the clinic unless she threw the black patients out, because she treated both blacks and whites. And she just pulled down the shade and went on working. She was an amazing woman, but she just did it. And she said it was very lonely to be a doctor because you just had nobody else to relate to. And Dorothea Dix, who just decided one day that she was going to go from town to town and find out where people were keeping the mentally ill. And it was always a basement or a jail or something. And then she'd write this stuff up and publish it and use it to lobby legislatures for mental
And when
hospitals.
you think how the task of informing other women in other places, of developing some kind of an interest in a topic like mental illness or just in politics or suffrage, how difficult that task was. We're so spoiled with the media now and the communication.
Well, the great thing, though, was that there was so little going on.
That
When
you
you
had
did stuff,
nothing
people
to...
tended to know. Dorothea Dix went to somewhere and said, hi, I'm Dorothea Dix. And they said, oh, my God, you're Dorothea Dix. And she said, well, how do you know about me? And they said, well, everybody knows you're the woman who goes around from town to town and works on mentally ill.
Yeah.
So the people who did this became very famous very fast, but it wasn't necessarily a fame that they coveted, because the idea that a woman should be famous was in itself really incredible.
What I found interesting was that the icons that I had grown up with remained icons, but that you've got these people who really flew under the radar and events that were really in Congress. You talk about the bicycle as this almost revolutionary thing, and I had never thought of the bicycle. Talk to us about bicycles.
Imagine, I mean, I'm a person who always wants to know when I'm looking at history, well, were their shoes comfortable? Where did they go to the bathroom, stuff like that. Women throughout the 19th century in particular were so dragged down by their clothes. They had these long skirts that could weigh 20, 30 pounds, all the petticoats, and you had corsets from your shoulders to your hips that you wore from the moment you got up in the morning, and long sleeves. I mean, it was just really hard to move. And the idea was you didn't move around. If you were a lady, you just sort of sat still. But of course, these women had children and everything else. They were running around, but they were dragged down, and suddenly the bicycle comes along. And for some reason, once it was invented, the safety bicycle that we know today, it was okay for women to do it too. And you can imagine if you had been a woman staggering around in all these clothes, suddenly you're on this thing zooping down the street. It was just totally liberating for them. And then, of course, once you really did it, you realized the corset is going to have to go, and that the skirts are not going to be able to be quite that long. You've got to sort of adapt a little bit. But that was a huge moment. It's like I always feel that the invention of the twist, the dance, was a huge moment.
Yes, go ahead.
It was like the first time that a popular dance that everybody could do was one that you didn't have to follow your partner.
Right, and you didn't have to be in physical contact.
No, and that was because men were always worse dancers than women.
And standing against the wall.
Yeah,
I know.
and you're stuck. You're stuck with the man. So, but then you could suddenly do it by yourself. And now, of course, girls just get up if they want to dance and dance.
They go out dancing. Right?
It was just huge at the moment. So there are all these sort of little neat things along the line, and then there are all these sort of neat people that you never knew about that just pop up out of nowhere.
I mean, the book is filled with literally scores, hundreds of folks that you never heard of that are substantial actors. The woman who sets fire to New York and masks Washington's retreat and saves the Continental Army. Who knew? They never taught us that stuff.
And Elizabeth Jennings is one of my absolute favorites. Elizabeth Jennings is an African-American woman in Manhattan. It's 1854. Right. She's running to catch the horse-drawn trolley because she needs to go to church to play the organ. She gets on, and the conductor says, wait for one for blacks. This is only for white people. And she goes nuts, and she grabs hold of it. She's screaming, she's kicking. They finally drag her up and throw her in jail for disturbing the peace. She hires Chester Alan Arthur, who was then a young lawyer, who later becomes president, and they sue the company. She wins several $100s, and she integrates the trams. And the thing about it that knocks me out is that A, this is 100 years before Rosa Parks. And B, this is not like a woman who's a member of the Society for Integrating the Horse-Drawn Trams. She just did this instinctively. And that was happening at that time all around the North, that you would have black women just get really, really angry when something like this happens. Sojourner Truth got arrested, Harriet Tubman got into a huge fight, on and on and on. But Elizabeth Jennings, who's just a school teacher who nobody knows, just did it in 1854. I really think when we finally get to have statues of women in this city, besides the one of Eleanor Roosevelt that we finally got, Elizabeth Jennings goes in Grand Central Station.
Okay, I was going
That's
to
a
ask
good one.
where to whom and where are the public monuments? You began answering the question
Well,
already.
to be fair, the reason there aren't more monuments of women is because all those monuments were thrown up for the most part in the 19th century, when the idea of that women were statesmen didn't come up very often. And now they're so expensive that it
They're
takes
very hard
forever
to
to
do.
get one. It took, I can't imagine how long it took to do Eleanor Roosevelt. It seemed like it was forever. And we finally got her in Riverside Park. But beyond that, it's Joan of Arc,
It's
Alice
that
in
woman,
Wonderland.
it's that man on top of all the women in Queens. And then when they finally came to do a statue in Queens, if you remember Catherine the Greater or whoever it was, then it got involved again into racial issues, and that got
Polish or something. It was it was an ethnic group thing that
it
she
was
had been-
African American.
Was it?
I think,
Okay.
yeah, because she was in the slave trade,
Well, there you are.
and so that's what happened.
Well, that's what you do if you go
But it
running
becomes
around to
harder.
other countries trying to pick up your heroines. You don't
Right,
really
you
have
don't
the
bring them from
background you
here.
need, Kim. Right.
Just
Go
go
on,
ahead.
no, you were.
The story is the major piece that ends the book is in August 1970 with Betty Friedan. A march that wasn't really expected to draw that many people. They're denied a permit in the street. You tell
Yeah, it
the
was a
story.
march for the ratification of the suffrage amendment, which is in itself a wonderful story. But so they're out and they're going to have this parade, and nobody seemed to think this was going. And they were very worried that they had not done enough effort on this, and that nobody was going to show up. And then you have sort of Betty Friedan, who tells the story in her book, is sort of trotting along, and suddenly her cab won't go anywhere, and she can't figure out what's wrong. And then she realizes it's all people. It's women and it's men and it's children, and they're all in the park and they're all ready to go, and they're supposed to stay on the sidewalk because they didn't have a permit for the street. And she looks back and sees all these people and just says, "Take to the street," and they
then
all
they
just
all
go
go.
marching away.
But it didn't come out of nothing. I mean,
No,
it
no,
was
not
a
at
time
all.
that was pretty good. There was the great discussion about abortion. Now had been it was at its height, wasn't it? I mean, not necessarily
Right.
membership, but at least for exposure and people
But there's
talking
always
about
a
it.
tendency with groups and with new things that you just sort of
don't
think that
understand.
although you know that your friends feel that way,
you
you
don't,
kind of
yeah.
feel like the rest of the world doesn't
Right.
agree, and that
Yeah.
there's
It actually followed, I guess, that the Atlantic City and the bra burning. when
yeah, well,
they
that
weren't
was earlier on, but they
right.
weren't really burning bras.
Right,
yeah.
right.
And one of the things that you brought up was the conflict, for example, between the Black Civil Rights Movement on one hand and the women's movement on the other. And you often point to these conflicts of these social movements that are attempting to expand the rights of people, but they come into conflict with one another.
And it's also because women
to
are
realize.
not just females. Women
Right.
are not just about their gender. I mean, when women first voted in 1920, I mean, people were terrified. That, oh my God, they're
And they voted for Harding.
Yeah, they voted for Warren Harding.
Well, that
for
was the
God's sake.
first of the gap, right? The
first gender, and I don't think
gender
there was a
gap? No?
gender gap.
No,
Right? It's
probably
the degree
not.
that
I
they
thought
knew
not.
one.
Okay.
But they voted with their ethnic group,
Yeah.
and they voted with their racial group, and they voted with
husbands.
their economic group. And I don't know that it was that they followed their husbands, but their husband was in the same
They always
boat that
a
they
great
were in,
I
you
mean,
know.
I think historically a great number of women used to follow
Certainly
their
they
husbands
vote
more
as
than
they
do
vote as a
now.
team, but it's sort of
Yeah.
natural because
Yeah.
you have the same interests.
Right.
You're in the same place wherever that is.
Right
for the
now, how
most
could you
part.
stay married to somebody who disagreed with you politically? I mean, I don't know how Matlin and Carville do it. Well, you, Jed, you have Jimmy. That's a different
We're
story
sympathetic,
altogether.
right? But I mean, we had it with you always had the racial thing. You had white women with slaves, right? Then when you went out to the frontier, you point out that you had the pioneers and the Mexicans, I guess, or no,
And also,
it was the
white women and Indians was
Indians.
very
Right, terrible. Well, the
early
Indians
on.
were
I mean,
yeah.
early on in the United States, women took their first leadership
Right.
positions as head of the "Let's Kill All the
Yeah.
Indian Groups" because it was actually natural. They're alone on the frontier. Their
Right.
husbands. The one thing you
They're
see
scared,
at this
right.
all the time is the husbands are always going off somewhere, and they were terrified.
It reminds me of the Cold War.
Indians. Yeah, there you are.
I mean, it's always used as a political. I mean, it becomes politically expedient, or it just comes as a result of what's happening around you, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, it always is. But, you know, so women have all these different things. So it's not like they're just sort of marching off being women. And that happened with the civil rights movement. Black women, you know, had interests in both areas. The early civil rights movement was incredibly sexist. I mean, the role of women, the women were denied leadership. You know, Rosa Parks comes out of jail in Montgomery and goes to the church for the big rally, and the minister said, well, you've already done enough, we'll do all the talking tonight, just sit there. And she goes to the Great March on Washington, where Martin Luther King makes his great speech, and she walks with the wives.
And they didn't have one woman
Didn't
talk.
have one woman talk.
No, that was striking. I didn't realize that until I read it.
But you know, for black women, there's all these different feelings, because for the one thing, throughout slavery and throughout all the segregation that followed Jim Crow years, women had a lot more freedom than men tended to, because white people would accept a certain amount of sassiness or independence on the part of women, whereas black men were always the great threat. So the idea of having your men being leaders was a new thing and very important to me.
So you're going to write a sequel?
Yeah.
You're going to bring us up to date?
Sort of, yeah. We're going to start in 1960. And
it's going to be interesting, because the changes...
Is Phyllis Schlafly in your book?
You
have to tell me.
She's in this
I know
one.
Is she in again?
Yeah.
She was annoying there, I have to tell you.
But you know, what I wanted to say was, it's always changing, and I think this year or the last couple of years there's been a great change, because I don't know, but I've always felt, you said, well, they didn't have Rosa Parks talk, or they said, all right, we'll do the talking. You know, I sat around a lot of political meetings and was right up there, and I always found I had to talk louder than anybody else. I had to talk more emphatically than anybody else, because they still weren't listening to women. It was a very hard thing, and I think we've really hit a point just in the last couple of years where that whole, you know, you see women now really making important decisions, I hope.
The thing that really knocked me out when I was thinking, actually, I started thinking about this book during the millennium, when they asked me to write an essay for the millennium issue on women. And the editor said at that time, I don't want to prejudice you on what you're going to write, but this feels like a win to me. You know, this is good news. And in fact, when I think about it, the vision of what women should do and could do has been one way for most of the history of Western civilization. And that in my lifetime, it changed. I mean, it changed radically. It really fundamentally changed. And that, to me, is the most amazing thing in the world. It just kills me every time I think about it.
It's changed since I started working at Ms. Magazine in 1972, right? We would not take Virginia Slim's advertising. That was the cigarette company that said, "You've come a long way, baby."
To get where you got your own cigarette now, baby.
Right. But then it was Philip Morris, and we would go, Gloria Steinem and Pat Carbine, who was the publisher, and me, we would go to Philip Morris and say, we want Marlboro, because they had, you know, the strong man, what was he called, from the West, right? Anyway, but that's changed, you know, so that whole thing has changed. That's a lot. Let's go to what you're doing now.
Yeah, I mean, in fact,
that was an enormous change.
Talking about the history, a woman's historian, but a woman making history as well. So you get appointed in August 2001 in the boring era to be the editorial page editor.
I must admit, I thought when they asked me, I thought, well, I'm actually an expert in state and local government. This is not, you know, I'm not greatly founded in foreign affairs in particular, but I thought, well, we're moving into a really boring time now. Nothing's happening. It's really dull. The economy's trotting along. Nothing's happening internationally. So I'm very good at making boring things interesting. So they probably want me because I can make all this boring stuff that's going to happen interesting. You know, and imagine my surprise.
Yeah, you have 9/11, two wars, plane crashes.
Yeah.
Do you find certain parallels between international politics and local politics?
That's a good question. Actually, all politics is in some ways exactly the same. There's always, you know, everybody's got their needs and they're bartering around to see who
It really
wins.
struck home when Bush, during one of the debates, said, "And Vladimir, we're friends," or something. I thought, well,
excuse me.
I guess that's so bad. But that is definitely, I mean, it is to
just
a
like
great
you're
degree
friends with
very
the mayor,
similar.
whoever it is, as long as it works out for both of you.
So what is it like? How large is the editorial department?
Well, the editorial department is about 54 people.
And are you the head of all of it?
Yeah.
So that means the editorials themselves, the letters to the editors, the op-ed page.
And the columnists.
And the columnists.
Yes, I have the whole team. And it's
Were you taken by surprise when you were
When I was
approach
asked?
yeah.
Pretty much, yeah. I was a columnist. You don't
Yeah.
normally turn to columnists for
And you're
stuff
not-
like that.
Well, you weren't the normal Times career path to that editorship at all, and I would presume that that road is no longer the road.
Yeah, things have changed. I mean, things have opened up so much. And I think even when I came there was still the idea that, you know, a really reliable Times person had been there for decades and decades and decades, and that's certainly no longer true. And
And it wasn't that many years ago that there was a suit just about employing women.
yeah,
Right?
yeah. And, you know, people often ask me, they want me to tell my story of suffering, you know, what I've gone through. And in fact, I haven't. And the reason I haven't is because of the extraordinary luck of my timing. I mean, I came in right after that incredible group of women, many of whom sacrificed their careers to bring a suit to try to force the Times to come to grips with gender bias.
Ruth Ginsburg was the lawyer, wasn't she?
I think she was, yeah.
Yeah. The
But,
Supreme
you know,
Court
I mean,
justice.
those women are still around. They're still
Yeah.
the heroes of the...
So
So
that-
you have your editorial board is how big? I mean, just give us a sense how this thing works.
There's 16 people on the editorial board, and we meet 3 times a week, and they each have areas of expertise.
there is some, they have
so I
those
mean,
areas.
they know what stuff they're responsible for. We have one member, Adam Cohen, who's been doing all of the making votes count pieces about the election. So we sort of know, especially right now, that every day Adam will have a new idea for an editorial about the election process and the voting machines and the long lines and the challenges to voters and the purging of the lists and so on and so forth, and you know, other people who are experts in foreign affairs or whatever. So we go around, we talk about what's in the news, and people volunteer to do stuff. Sometimes we ask them to do stuff, and then Andy Rosenthal, who's my deputy, and I make up a list of what we're going to do that day, and then people write them, and then we edit them.
Now the we is
Andy and I,
okay.
Do you have
and Helene
arguments?
Cooper, who is our new
So
assistant.
do you have arguments?
Sometimes we have great arguments.
Or discussions.
Often we have little weenie arguments. People told me that before we went into Iraq that you could just really paid money to come into the board meetings because they were so intense at that time and very, 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 very. I mean, everybody's always polite and they love each other, but very, very intense fights about that.
Does everybody like each other? You
Pretty
don't have to
much.
name names,
No,
but I mean, I
pretty
just wondered.
much. It's an incredibly collegial board, and when I had the chance to hire people, I hired partly on that basis. I mean, you really want a board that can work together, and I'm always informed by them. You know, when we do endorsements and things like that, there's a team that interviews all the candidates, but after the interviews, then the team will come back to us and we'll discuss. And often I found that I would go into a discussion thinking, well, we should go this way, and I'm informed by the stuff that they say.
When I was more active in politics, I would never call anybody on the editorial board, or very, very rarely, because I always thought that was sort of like a breach of ethics. But I know there are people who call all the time.
Oh, yes.
And then I wondered maybe it serves the other way, because I believe, I mean, lobbyists, some lobbyists are wonderful and some lobbyists are terrible, but a lot of elected officials depend on lobbyists or advocates. So is that how it works at the board too?
It's the same as with I mean, our board members. One of the things I think that defines the Times board is that all of them report very aggressively. I mean, they don't just read the piece in the paper and then come up with an opinion. They call people, they get more information, they check facts, and they often find there's what there always is. There's certain politicians that are just really smart and they know a whole lot of stuff, and they can always help you to get the information you need, especially if you know from experience that your values tend to be the same as the board's values. Then you do tend
So
to.
how do you appropriate the space or time to international, national, local? I mean, it is the New York Times,
Yeah.
even though it's the paper of record and most people
I mean,
think
part
of
of it's
it
just
beyond New York.
you know, contingent events, but
Well, we
there are
struggled.
complaints,
We
aren't
struggled
they?
a lot with that because more than half of our circulation now is outside the metropolitan region, and I never felt like if you were a California reader, obviously California readers want to know certain things about New York. They want to hear, you know, how Ground Zero is doing, or you know, anything else that seems very New Yorky. They don't want to know about the civil court judges and stuff like that. So for a long time when I came in, we were flipping things. We were running one editorial in New York, and then we put a different one nationally. And there'd be a little note saying in the local section there's an editorial on George Pataki, and in the national section there's one on AIDS. And you can go on the web and find both. Got many complaints from people locally saying, we don't want George Pataki, we want AIDS. No one nationally called and said we want George Pataki.
Right.
So we sort of tried again, and so lately what we've been doing is we've developed sections, regional section editorial pages in Long Island, Westchester, and the city.
Right.
And each of those editorials is either about state issues or about Long Island, Westchester, or the city.
Yeah, the city section is particularly...
The city section is starting to run editorials.
Yes.
The same thing is happening in Long Island and Westchester.
But, but there's a problem with that also, because, Swazi's been very interesting in the state, and we don't know what's happening.
Well, actually, a lot of Swazi things, because they're state issues, we do run there. We try our best, but it never quite works out. This time, in an effort to, particularly to get people to realize we had the editorial pages in the region, we did our Senate endorsement when we endorsed Chuck Schumer in the regionals. Right. And we got bitter letters from people in Buffalo who, for some reason, get the national edition saying, once again, Buffalo has been ruled out. And you feel terrible, but there's really no way to make everybody happy. I would have thought
Schumer would have complained.
No, he was happy.
Right.
Do you want to? I was going to
go ahead.
On whose behalf does the editorial board write the editorials?
The editorial board speaks for the editorial page. We don't speak for the paper. The New York Times does not have opinions because most of the Times is a news section, which is totally cut off from us. They have nothing to do with us. We're in a different part of the building. We don't talk to each other, and it's not. We do not have meetings to discuss what we're going to do. They don't know. They have no idea what we're doing, and they have no control over us. But
your guys who have the expertise, for instance, in Iraq, will talk to a reporter.
They'll talk to reporters about issues of fact. What time is the vote going to happen in Congress, stuff like that. But the reporters know that they're not ever to say, and you should really say this is bad. They don't do that. They never go there, and that's very important to us.
I wanted to talk about opinion in the time of war. You gave a speech, I believe, at Stanford about this, and it was rather hard-hitting on the internet and cable TV. And talk about wrestling with objectivity between opinion and facts, and how you have to deal with it as the most powerful editorial board editor in the United States, certainly.
It used to be, that all papers were all opinion all the time. They started having newspapers. They belonged to a political party, and you wrote only about how great Thomas Jefferson was or how bad Thomas Jefferson was. And over the years, it started to divide.
It's particularly interesting. I have to interrupt because you, either in the speech or someplace, you talked about how they looked for personal advancement. And so the one guy, who was the guy that you wrote about and talked about in your speach?
Oh, Duff Green.
Yes, that was a great story.
Who got to be, he was an Andrew Jackson guy, and he particularly had been aggressive in writing about, because Andrew Jackson had been so vilified because of his marriage, which was somewhat irregular. He was living with this woman when she was married to somebody else, but. So Duff Green started all of these rumors about John Quincy Adams, his opponent, who was the most boring human being in the world, but theories that,
interesting.
Yes, they'd lived together before they were married, or on and on. So after the election, Duff Green not only got the printing contracts for the House and the Senate, but his son became the ambassador to, I think, Russia, and another son, I think it was, got Florida. They basically took half the country as a reward. It worked very, very well.
When did it change? When did it change from this partisan opinion to a more objectivity-based standard?
My feeling about newspapers and the media is that it all had to do with economics. Once you had large circulation newspapers that wanted to make money off ads, not just by selling to partisans. And of course the ads appeal to everybody, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or a communist or a socialist or whatever. Didn't like the idea anymore of being seen as partisan. It was better for business to be objective, and I think that's where the ethos developed. And I always think that the reason we still have opinion pages and editorials is to remind the rest of the paper, among other things, of where the opinion goes. It goes there. It's not supposed to schlep off into the rest of the paper, and it's worked out well. I think with the internet, my theory is that whenever you've got a lot of small, undercapitalized media that's trying to get attention, you're going to have very vicious very partisan, very unreliable, very personal kinds of journalism. You saw that around the turn of the century when you'd be in a town the size of Hartford would have 6, 7, 8, 10 papers, and they'd all be these little papers that somebody started, and they'd all be desperate to get attention.
They have to be loud, and they have to be
so this is how,
mean.
if you're Grover Cleveland and you're running from Buffalo, suddenly this whole story will come out about how you have an illegitimate child because this paper, the Buffalo Telegraph, really wanted people to pay attention to it. And this went on until the papers got much bigger and more consolidated. I think the same thing is happening now, particularly with the internet. You can start a blog for 3 cents.
But it's all opinion.
Yeah.
There's no editing, except insofar as they begin to edit you folks, the more traditional
But there can be some
media.
facts. It's not all opinion.
Well, no,
I mean,
but
there's no oversight.
there's no oversight.
Right.
There's no fact checking.
And it's
fact.
interesting. Well, more and more, I think you're seeing as things go on that there are people who are trying to make their name on the internet as a source that's reliable, that is fact-based, and that can be trusted.
Well, in fact, I mean, the bloggers have had an influence. I mean, in the Rather case, for example. In fact, your change in your op-ed columnist correction, I believe, was in some sense started by a blogger. No,
Not really.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It had always been there.
See, I read it on the internet.
We'd always
Was it
had that
reliable?
theory. We had
Go
always
ahead.
had that policy that the columnist had to correct their own errors within the pieces.
Okay.
But
I thought in fact, I think I did read it on the web that was a result of a blogger.
Do you decide on the columnists you hired? Well, some of them were
the
there.
publisher chooses the columnist. I certainly talk
Do you
with them
miss
a lot about
writing
it.
a column?
I thought I would, and of course when I started, I was finishing this very long book, so I didn't miss writing at all. And then I thought, once I finished the book, well, I'm either going to have to write another book or I'm going to have to go back and start writing more. And then I signed a contract to write another book. So,
I think it's in your last column. You wrote about the Democratic Convention, feed but do not annoy the swing voters, and it's rather a harsh indictment of the
Electoral
Democratic
College,
of the Electoral
yes.
College and the Democratic Party. And again, you did an editorial. The bell rings in my head. You guys did an editorial on the Electoral College,
Right.
and I read it and said they're right, but they're out of their minds. It's never going to change.
well, let's see. If John Kerry wins the electoral vote but loses the popular vote, we'll see how.
You think there will
people
not be
feel
the same
about the
type of
electorate.
reaction?
Well, no, I think there will be, but I think that there'll be a more bipartisan questioning of whether or
whether
not the
it has
electoral
system.
Now that
electoral
it's
college
happened
works,
both ways.
Yeah.
So how do you think this election shapes up?
Jeepers, it's all about, to me, all about the turnout
Right.
thing, and that's why we're so interested in all these questions about
What's going to happen?
the
at the polls?
regularity of the process at the polls, because in Ohio, for instance, it's okay if you're a poll watcher sent by your party to simply question any given voter for a long time about their signature or the way their ID looks, and while you can't get them thrown out normally, you can make things really, really take a long time. And if you're a working person and you come to the polls and see a 2-hour line waiting to get in, and there have been apparently already in Florida, in the pre-voting period, 3-hour lines with these little old ladies in their oxygen tents, standing there waiting and waiting and waiting to vote. So,
And then flu shots.
yeah, we celebrate other cultures where they get on donkeys and ride for 6 hours to vote, but you really do not think that's the way it ought to work. It should be very easy.
Well, this election, ironically, we're presenting ourselves as this beacon of democracy, or at least the president is, and that this is our system, and you need international observers. You know this is going to be litigated. If it looks anything like the polls look like now, this is going to hit the Supreme Court again, and you're going to have another 5-4 vote, possibly choosing the president of the United States.
We could do it all over again.
We could do it all over again.
Yeah.
Did you have great discussions about who you would endorse when it came time for a presidential endorsement?
About whether to endorse George Bush or John. No, I think that probably did not. That was it. The pressure to try to write an endorsement that was useful and interesting was particularly great, since I don't think the entire world was on the edge of their seats
Right.
waiting to see who
Right.
we'd endorse.
Right.
But that's true of presidential endorsements in general. I don't think
It's usually, is it,
people
agree.
are moved about who they're going to vote for by endorsements, but it contributes to sort of the general conversation
Right.
about what's going on. Where the most important is the littler the office, civil court
His-
judges,
well-
city
Right.
councils.
Right.
stuff like
when
that.
there's a newsstand on 72nd Street and Broadway, and my headquarters, the first time I ran, I had something like 7 opponents, is on 72nd Street. And when we came back from a coffee meeting that night, the news dealer yelled at me, "You got it, you got it." And I mean, he read the endorsement, and I still see him, and he still talks about it. So
Well, that endorsement's
that was the key. Yeah.
Certainly at the local level is the endorsement. That's worth, I mean, everybody talks about it being worth, 5 to 10 points in a race. So, I
Well,
mean,
especially in some neighborhoods.
Oh,
it's very
absolutely.
important. But it's, and the people who do the endorsing take it, the lead people take it
Oh, I
so
know.
seriously, and they suffer so much. Every year there's always one new person on, and the first time I did it, when I was on the board, I really thought I was going to die. It was so hard. And you talk to all these people, and you took everything they said so seriously. And then in city council races, especially, or in
I've
primaries,
done this. You too.
there's not any great ideological divide between, there's
Well,
hardly
there's
any
a
parties
basic
for the
divide
most part.
sometimes between intelligence and stupidity,
Well,
but
there's a lot
that's
of that
a little
going
hard to
around out
find
there. But
sometimes too.
you don't often get like a perfect race in which you've got this
Right.
one paragon and
Right.
another doofus.
Well, I was interested today in the editorial about Connecticut, the
yeah.
Shays endorsement, because that had to be a little bit of a pull, since it was a Democrat. No, I guess, well, you're not a Democratic paper, I guess.
we try to be fair about these
Yeah.
things, and so anyway,
Right.
the endorsements speak for themselves.
Right. Was the support for Kerry unanimous?
On the board, we never talk about those
Oh,
things.
oh, right, I know, but I
Wait a
thought I'd
minute.
try.
You would ask us?
And columnists are not members of the board.
No, they're not.
No.
No, they have.
Now, how do you interact with the op-ed columnists? But you've got columnists now. Well, opinions migrated from the
Analysis.
editorial
They
page
call it analysis.
or analysis.
And the
or-
difference between analysis and an editorial is that the analysis seeks to explain to you what's going on, but the person writing it doesn't have a dog
Right,
in the fight.
right.
The person writing an analysis is not trying to convince you that Kerry was wrong or Bush was right or that whatever. They're trying to give you as much
Sure.
insight as they can. We're trying to convince you. On the editorial board, we are trying to change your mind to make you want to get up and vote for these people or to go out and lobby against this bill. We have a dog in every fight.
But then there are the people almost in between, but closer to the editorial, like a Clyde Haberman or a Joyce Pernick, who they are opinion pieces, but oftentimes they are as hard-hitting and opinionated as your editorials
Are they considered columnists also?
They're considered news columnists, and there are different standards for news columnists.
Could we just
and
talk about
opinions.
Iraq, because I think we wouldn't be
course,
right. All right, so let's show describe the evolution of the editorial board's position on Iraq.
Well, the editorial board's position was greatly determined by the fact that we were convinced there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq.
And how was that based?
Well, that everybody that we talked to thought there were weapons of mass destruction. That the Clinton people thought there were weapons of mass destruction. And also, I realized looking back on it now that simply it was logic. I mean, I kept saying over and over again, look, the man would not allow his country to be invaded and his own safety and position to be totally undermined if he didn't have them. That would be
See,
crazy. That would be
that's
nuts.
That is
you
the
know.
same phenomenon as saying this guy is not smart.
Right.
But he must be smart. I must be missing something, because how could he be president without being smart, right?
We wrote an editorial a while back saying, look, we probably, if we'd been as rigorous as humanly possible, we still would have thought there were weapons of mass destruction there. But there were people out there who didn't, and we should have been more proactive in giving you that information, and we apologize for that.
Yeah, and it was really a pause for hindsight on July 16, 2004. It's really a remarkable editorial. I mean, if I may, the first sentences. Over the last few months, this page has repeatedly demanded that President Bush acknowledge the mistakes his administration made when it came to the war in Iraq. ellipses. If we want Mr. Bush to be candid about his mistakes, we should be equally open about our wrong. And this is a pretty hard-hitting self-reflection here. And then if you read some of the reporting, I mean, some of your reporting, I mean, The Times is reporting, clearly led people like myself to buy into the administration's argument in a way that it wouldn't have been as legitimized had you not done it.
I think the editors have said, and they wrote their own long famous thing about this, that the profound error was an error in editing. That can imagine there'd be any editor who, if a reporter came back and said, look, this guy who's the leader of the outside people going back in, who's also the man who the administration is most listening to, brings us this information, and I'm going to write a story about it, you wouldn't say, yes, go ahead. So the error, I think that the editors have said that I agree with, is that you then should have been much more active in going out and looking for other people who had other thoughts about it. You should have been, although they always defined in the piece where the information was coming from, should have been much more active about making those things clear.
That's a major problem. Yeah. I mean, that points to a basic problem that we've always had, that people who are in opposition to the popular thing are fewer in number, or maybe not fewer in number, but fewer in experts. Do you know what I mean?
I do. There were experts on both. What we should have been doing was paying more attention to the international observers.
Yeah.
And we should have given more credence to what they were doing and what they were saying.
You raise an interesting point here, and that is the editor's responsibility versus the reporter's responsibility. What is the reporter's responsibility in that case, in a general sense, but reflecting on this specific reporting?
The reporter's responsibility is to bring back information and to put it together in the most accurate way he or she can, reflecting what he or she knows to be the reality of the situation. It's the job of the editor, who's got a whole bunch of reporters out there, to go and say, well, yeah, but what about this?
Okay.
And where are we going to place this?
Okay.
And should we put another story in, and all that sort of thing. So it's and God knows mistakes were made all over the place. But I think that the thing we've been arguing about, certainly through this campaign, is, okay, we made some really bad mistakes here, but we can't go forward unless we acknowledge what they were to everybody and then try to rectify them. We're going to have to do the best we can to get ourselves out of this.
So does this make people question more what the government says?
I think that that's the greatest, we've written this, the greatest disservice that this administration has done, is that the next time there's some desperate information that suggests North Korea is preparing to attack, or the next time there's some dreadful, terrorist danger of nuclear weapons being smuggled, it's going to be harder to get the public's confidence in it because we've lost it on this.
Sort of a law of perverse consequences.
Your own confidence
in
what information how you look at the information that you've gotten. I mean, I think that that's a constant thing.
One thing I want to turn to now is the Novak case, since your paper is centrally involved in that investigation. And comment?
We believe that our reporter, Judy Miller, is refusing to reveal her sources. We believe it's so very important for newspapers to be able to offer confidentiality to people who are speaking about things that could get them into huge trouble if they were revealed. And that's just so critical to the way we do our business.
Is this a unique but periodic phenomenon, or is this endemic? Are you seeing a trend here? Are you seeing something more than this almost perpetual conflict?
Well, it's very disturbing that Judy Miller, who did not write anything about Valerie Plame, who was the question of revealing the fact that Valerie Plame was a CIA agent, is
Bob Novak's column.
That she's at the same time in another case, which goes back to a story that ran 3 years ago, that there's an attempt to subpoena her list of contacts, her telephone lists. The danger of this, and what's happened to other reporters, like Matt Cooper, that have gone into this, is that if you attempt to take some little area and say, okay, well, in this one case, I'm going to tell you because it seems like it won't do any harm, and the guy's already said that's okay, and so on. It never ends there. You know, instantly they came back to my career and said, well, yes, but who else did you talk to? You know, and people, it's part of the way we do business that so many states have enshrined in shield laws, because they understand that the free press is so important to a healthy democracy, and it's almost impossible for reporters to do their job if they can't offer confidentiality to people who can be punished gravely if they speak.
How does this get resolved? How will it get resolved, or how ought it get resolved?
Did you write an editorial about this? A national shield law, right?
Yeah. A national shield law would be the right answer to it, because it depends so much from state to state. And if there's a federal prosecution, then that's, you know.
So we're facing now more national laws. We think we should have some national standards for presidential elections.
We really think we should have national standards for presidential elections. It's completely crazy that rogue secretaries of state can run around and saying, okay, you know, nobody gets to be registered as a voter unless they filled out a registration form that was on 80 millimeter stock or whatever it was of paper. Or that, okay, I've decided that we're going to count all these things for president, but we're not going to count them for the U.S. Senate. Or I've decided that we're going to go and throw out everybody who sounds like a criminal. You know,
we've come to the end, of, so we want people to vote.
Just the beginning.
I hope
vote, yes, even if you've got...
so we want people to
just
vote.
Just the beginning.
I hope
vote, yes, even if you've got to stand in line.
I hope people have learned how the Times comes up with its positions and understands your department better, and I certainly hope they read this book. And
absolutely.
Thank you,
Thank
and
you.
I thank you very much for
Thanks
coming.
very much.
My pleasure. It was great.